Hey all, here at OS Reviews. In this video, we are taking a throwback review of the Nokia Lumia Icon. This was also known as the Lumia 930 in international markets, and it's, in my opinion, one of the most underrated Nokia Lumia Windows phones. The culmination of all the beautiful design, meticulously put into just a very powerful phone for its time. So revisiting this device now in a little more detail, we are looking at a 5-inch OLED display, which has a 1080p resolution. Like most OLED panels, it just has inky blacks and just awesome contrast levels, coupled with these gentle 2.5D curves on the edge of the glass that slightly bubbles up, making swipe navigation just feel super smooth and responsive, and the entire display almost floats, kind of like a pillow, resembling the tiles that is matching the Metro UI. And by the way, this phone is now running on Windows Phone 10, but as we know, this is pretty much the last version of Windows Phone, since this is a mobile OS that is no longer around, unfortunately, as Microsoft have kind of left this behind. Now they're using the Surface Duo, but powered by Android. What also made this phone really stand out, in my opinion, was the use of this aluminum frame that was just super sleek, and these sharp, minimalistic, modern edges reminds me of something like, say, an iPhone 4, but even cleaner in a way because of how everything is just so symmetrical. It is perhaps not the most comfortable in the world to touch compared to polycarbonate plastic or rounded corners, but it definitely makes the phone feel really premium and sleek with some of these integrated antenna bands. By the way, the back here features the micro USB port for charging, but the Lumia Icon also supported Qi wireless charging, one of the earlier phones to do that. The side here also features a dedicated volume key, power key, which are all etched in metal, feeling super responsive and tactile, along with a 2-stage camera shutter key. Long holding would automatically trigger the camera as well. Which, speaking of, on this particular phone, it came with a Zeiss PureView 20 megapixel camera lens with a dual tone LED flash. This was the same sensor found on the phablet-sized Nokia Lumia 1520, also coupled by the Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 chipset along with 2 gigabytes of RAM, which were both cutting edge for the time. The top here also features a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, unfortunately something that we just don't see anymore on modern day smartphones. What's also quite neat here is you can pull down the slot to access very easily the SIM card tray. Perhaps the only element of the design that I'm not the biggest fan of would be the single speaker, which is unfortunately placed at the very back of the phone. But what Nokia has exercised here is just a masterclass in minimalism. Everything is just so beautiful in terms of the clean aesthetics and edges. Just made the entire experience pop and feel quite special when handling and looking at this phone. And I have to say that Windows Phone, for all its flack, was really a beautiful UI. Everything is just so clean and minimalistic, just like the hardware on this phone. But unfortunately, here in 2022, as expected for a defunct OS, many of these apps will just no longer function. Case in point, Microsoft has decommissioned Cortana, their virtual assistant support on Windows phones a few years back. You can still use the keyboard to type things out, which by the way still remains an excellent keyboard experience that supports swipe, but you can't really search by voice anymore. Other applications which are a little bit more not quite so good because of their decommission would be the weather app even. So if you try and launch into this, it's quite a simple application, but even this tells you to try and update it from the store, which you can still open up, by the way, and find content for. However, in the case of this particular app, looks like it has been upgraded to work on PCs. It's using the MSN Weather app, but it tells you that it's been pre-installed, but when you try to launch it, it will then say you are not able to use this until you upgrade. So again, just some of these basic utility apps even, which are internet connected, just no longer being functional. Even the Lumia camera app, which surprisingly, since it's not connected to the internet, has been decommissioned and tells you just to use the default camera app instead. So it's a little confusing, but the phone actually came with 2 camera apps back in the day. The Lumia version of the app that just gave you a little bit more software tricks, including a slider interface, which you can use to change things like ISO, exposure, versus the default, which has a little bit more limited support in terms of granular controls. Now, that one is a little bit unfortunate that it has been removed, but it is what it is. Same thing goes with some of the other kind of enabled apps on here, like here maps even, as you see, will jump out. But at the end of the day, it's kind of expected for an OS that has been shut down now for quite a while, and you will still occasionally find applications that will work. For instance, the default Bing Maps on here will still function, offering GPS capabilities really without too many issues that you can still use to geotag your photos, and of course making calls, text messaging, using the built-in Office apps for Word, PowerPoint, Excel, as well as some of the tools like Internet Explorer will obviously still work. But at the end of the day, you have to just keep in mind that this is a defunct OS that just isn't going to receive any more updates in terms of software support down the line. So what you see here is pretty much the extent of what you'll find. But at the very least, yes, it will still connect to the internet, and you can do a little bit of basic web browsing. So case in point, if we try to type in The Verge, one of the things that you can tell here is, for the most part, it doesn't feel too sluggish. After all, it was a flagship in terms of specs back in the day, especially for Windows phones that were really known to be well performing even on lower end hardware. So on a Snapdragon 800 series chip, it really flew. These days, of course, you will still see moments of hesitation, but for the most part, things are still serviceable and definitely can be used when it comes to just reading back some quick articles. Text details look still really sharp on this display, especially with the beautiful contrast and colors. This browser really was ahead of its time because of some of the placements of the address bar at the bottom of the display, just making it so much easier to hit versus having to do a little bit of hand gymnastics like on Android just to get to that address bar, something that these days, of course, Android and iOS have started to adopt as well, but just one of the really nice UI elements on Windows Phone back in the day. So when it comes to just doing a bit of reading an article search, you can see that the experience is not that bad. You can still open up different applications, different windows, and they will run there in the background. So speaking of some other gestures, just reminiscing on Windows Phone, you can also long hold on that Windows key for a few seconds to also enter into a one-handed mode. So in case you were unable to reach the top of your phone, it was a really nice shortcut that, again, cared about the ergonomics of the smartphone experience, really thoughtful for the time. Along with on the back key, if you long hold, that will open up the multitasking tray in which you're able to use gestures to swipe out of applications like cards. Again, very much ahead of its time as well, considering that this is pretty much now the way that we interact with Android and iOS. So if we launch into the camera experience next, again, that 20 megapixel Zeiss PureView lens, it was one of the best cameras for its time. But we've definitely come a long way in terms of computational photography, especially due to the Pixel phones, and now kind of affecting the entire industry in that sense. Perhaps the biggest difference that you'll observe here is that shutter speed is just considerably slower than on modern-day smartphones. However, it's often worth the wait to just have it processed a few seconds longer because the end results are still very detailed, thanks to that, again, up to 20 megapixel resolution, although it typically downsizes the photos to 16 megapixels, but you can also output a RAW version to get more resolution if desired. Again, that HDR can also work magic in terms of bumping up the contrast and just making the overall shots look much more juicy as well as colorful and vibrant. That was really ahead of its time. However, looking back now on this phone, HDR processing is definitely intensive on the processor and GPU because it will get significantly warm, obviously warm, when you are holding the phone and taking a lot of images, not to mention that sometimes these photos will require a few seconds to process in the background. Granted, the end results can definitely still be shocking. For instance, this indoor shot of ice cream that I took just a few moments earlier, you can tell a lot of details have been preserved. The contrast levels and colors really do shine, especially on this beautiful OLED screen. And one of the interesting features of the HDR on this phone is it gives you the ability to even slide and customize the extent of the HDR strength directly on the phone itself. Outdoor shots definitely look the best, and in some scenarios I was even taken aback just by how gorgeous some of these details are of this leaf and that natural bokeh. Of course, the effect is not quite as dramatic as on the aforementioned 1020, which has a bigger camera lens, sensor that is, along with, of course, newer phones these days that are starting to give us 1-inch camera sensors, but it still is a very convincing effect that is just due to the optics and physics on this camera sensor. So again, when you are patient with it, primarily keeping in mind the slower processing speed now versus on modern-day smartphones, you can still undeniably get some gorgeous-looking shots. Same thing goes with video recording. You're able to actually record shots up to 4K 30 FPS. That was also quite advanced back in the day, even if it did make the phone quite warm and drain the power a little bit quickly, considering that it is using a 2,400 milliamp hour capacity cell, which was a little small even for its time, coupled with the 1080p resolution of the screen meant that this was usually just a one-day phone. Touch up and edit photos in the Creative Studio, as well as the Cinemagraph, which is an app that still works. works. It will capture essentially an early version of motion photos that was also very advanced for its age. Not to mention other utility tools, which are just beautifully designed due to their elegance and simplicity. It really matches the entire vibe of the phone, having these very beautiful looking widgets. Again, it was ultimately the lack of, I would say, apps that made it really tough to sell Windows phones in general. Despite all the beauty here, you would really primarily be using the included applications, an awesome camera, along with some of the basic, let's say, social media apps and the web browser. But if you wanted to find the latest games in the Microsoft Store, that was sometimes really hard to do compared to the vast collection on the Google Play Store and the iOS Store, because of their first mover advantage. Especially with lower sales, developers just didn't really want to create another version of their app on this platform, and that became kind of a cycle of its own. Less apps meant less consumers wanting to go for it, and then that entire loop just persisted until, unfortunately, Microsoft deemed that it wasn't able to continue with this platform. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look at the Nokia Lumia Icon, aka Lumia 929, 930, known internationally. I think it still remains as one of the most iconic classic Nokia smartphones, at least their modern designs, just because of the beautiful sharp angular corners, premium aluminum touch, and its wealth of features hidden underneath, from using an AMOLED screen, a fast processor, a great camera, wireless charging, everything you wanted in a Windows phone, minus perhaps support for Continuum, because at the time this phone was still using a micro USB port as opposed to USB Type-C. Thanks for watching this revisited look here at OS Reviews. That's been the Nokia Lumia Icon.